Under a sky the color of split ash and early smoke, the village of Kamwenja sat nestled between rustling hills and quiet woods. It was a place where people rose with the sun and lay down when the moon carved shadows across their doorsteps. Here life followed the pace of breath, slow, steady, and silent. But silence took on a different meaning the day Nia stopped speaking. She had been a bright and curious child, always humming to herself or muttering words she barely understood, often repeating things adults said with uncanny clarity. Her mother said she had the voice of a bird and the memory of an elder. She used to sing lullabies back to her mother word for word, echo them in the voice she just heard, like her voice wasn't just her own. Sometimes her mother would stop in the middle of cooking just to listen, softly stunned by the way Nia's song seemed older than her 5 years. But something happened on a fog-heavy morning that made the child's voice vanish, as if it had been stolen. She had been playing outside near the tall, crooked fig tree behind the compound. Her cousins had gone ahead, chasing a lizard into the bush, and Nia had lingered as she often did, talking to flowers or trailing ants with her finger. When they returned, barefoot and grinning, they found her standing perfectly still, hands clenched at her sides, eyes wide and wet, her little mouth open like she wanted to speak but couldn't remember how. She never said another word after that. At first her mother thought she was sulking. Then she thought Nia might be frightened of something, perhaps a snake had slithered too close or a bee had stung her. But her daughter only shook her head, over and over, each time someone asked what she'd seen. Not a single sound escaped her lips, not a whisper, not a hum, not a sigh. By nightfall, panic had begun to slither through the house like wind through broken walls. The father, a quiet man named Kazi, paced outside while the mother wept beside Nia's cot. The neighbors came to listen and peer and offer explanations. Evil spirits, shock, childhood mischief, possession. They took her to the village doctor, a woman with wrinkled hands and sharp eyes who pressed her stethoscope to Nia's chest and said softly, "There is nothing wrong here. Her tongue moves. Her breath is steady. This is not a sickness of the body." The silence deepened. By the third day, Nia's mother took her to the healer who lived at the edge of the village, where the grasses grew tall and the wind sounded like voices. The healer, known as Bibi Nana, placed a bowl of ash and salt at Nia's feet and stared at her for a long, long time. She asked no questions. She only studied her, the shape of her mouth, the flicker in her eyes, the way her fingers twisted her dress. Then she said without looking away, "She is holding something back." The mother's voice cracked. "What is she holding?" "Something she saw," Bibi Nana replied. "Something too big for her little body. It's caught in her throat, trapped behind the breath. Can it be removed?" "No," the healer said. "Not until she is ready to speak it." They returned home with Nia still mute, her small hands wrapped in her mother's shawl. Her father refused to talk about it. He told the neighbors she was simply shy, that she would grow out of it. But whispers had already begun. Some said she had been cursed. Others claimed she had wandered too close to the boundary stones in the forest, where the dead sometimes lingered. One woman swore she saw Nia speaking to shadows. By the end of the week, children were being pulled away from her in the market. One child screamed when Nia looked at him too long. Her mother began keeping her inside. The school refused to take her. Even the church said a blessing over the compound. And still Nia said nothing. She watched everything. She noticed the things no one else paid attention to, the way her father's hands shook when the wind came from the east, how her mother's laughter changed when people were near. She watched lips move and memorized words, catalogued the rhythm of sentences, the tone of secrets. She saw too much and felt more than a child should. Sometimes at night she would wake up crying but not scream. Not even a gasp. Only tears and the creaking of her bed as she rocked back and forth. Her mother would hold her, humming softly as if trying to feed her sound again. But sound never came. Her father changed after that. He grew colder, quieter than usual. He came home later, left earlier, and barely looked at her. The villagers thought he blamed the girl for what had happened. But the truth was more complicated. His fear was not of what she couldn't say, but of what she might one day remember. Years passed. Nia grew taller. Her hair thickened, her eyes sharpened. But her silence remained. She did not hum. She did not sigh. She became like a well, deep, dark, still. People forgot what she had sounded like. Even her mother, sometimes, would place a hand to her own ear and try to remember her daughter's voice and fail. It was as if the world had swallowed her voice and refused to give it back. She learned to communicate with her eyes. With her hands. A slight gesture meant yes. A longer blink meant no. Her mother became fluent in her silences. The rest of the world grew uneasy. By the time Nia was 10, she no longer looked startled when people crossed the street to avoid her. She no longer looked surprised when shopkeepers dropped change without touching her hand. Her world had narrowed to her mother's arms, Bibi Nana's nods, and the feel of the sky pressing down just before rain. She often stood by the fig tree where it had all started. She would press her fingers into its bark, as if searching for the memory buried in its roots. But the image wouldn't come. Just the feeling of something behind her. Watching. Breathing. Her aunt moved into the house when she turned 12, after her mother fell ill. The woman was firm, with sharp elbows and a sharper mouth, and said often, "If you can't speak, you must be hiding something." She watched Nia with narrowed eyes and locked certain doors behind her. The father never argued. The village children called her the ghost girl by then. But Nia remained calm. Because deep inside her, behind her silence, she had begun to feel something shift. A weight. A presence. A kind of slow stirring, like a dream clawing its way back toward memory. She still didn't speak. But something was listening. Ask ChatGPT. The house, once warm with her mother's laughter, grew colder with every passing year. Nia moved through its corridors like a ghost in her own story, a figure of flesh wrapped in silence, always watching, always remembering. The rooms held shadows now, not just from the low-hung oil lanterns but from the things no one spoke about. Her mother's perfume had long faded from the curtains. The smile in the framed photographs on the mantel seemed too bright, too forced, too far away from the reality they lived in now. Nia had grown taller. Her limbs were long, her movements quiet, smooth as water. She rarely wore shoes inside the house, and the wooden floor creaked only under the weight of others. Her silence, once feared as a symptom, had become a weapon, sharp, patient, invisible. She heard more than anyone thought she could. She understood more than anyone dared guess. Her father, Kazi, had once been a calm man, never warm but consistent. After her mother died, that consistency began to crack like old paint. He spoke less and drank more. He no longer sat at the table for meals. Sometimes he would stare at the wall in the sitting room for hours without blinking, his hand twitching against the bottle, his lips moving in a whisper Nia could never hear. He checked the locks at night. Once, then twice, then 5 times. Every door, every window. He nailed shut the old cellar entrance no one used. He salted the corners of the house and hung dried herbs at the thresholds, though he told no one why. When Nia walked in on him pouring black powder into a jar and muttering under his breath, he didn't startle. He only turned, looked at her hollowly and said, "Don't go into the west wing. Ever." She didn't nod. She didn't blink. She just stood, her arms at her sides, absorbing everything like paper absorbs ink. That was the same week her aunt arrived. Aunt Weema came from the northern coast, or so she said. She brought little with her, just a trunk, a prayer mat, and a long coat with too many pockets. She smelled like cloves and paper, and she never smiled unless someone was watching. From the beginning she treated Nia not as a niece but as a project. A question mark. A nuisance that must be folded and hidden like bad laundry. She still doesn't talk? Weema asked her brother that first night, loud enough for Nia to hear. She doesn't need to, Kazi said stiffly. She should. It's unnatural. She's alive. That's enough. From then on, Aunt Weema took charge of Nia's days. She supervised her chores, measured her food, locked the garden gate. When Nia tried to watch the sky from the rooftop, Weema pulled her down by the wrist and locked the hatch. "We don't tempt fate," she said. "The girl should stay in her place." Her place, it seemed, was between the hours of other people. She cleaned when they slept. She walked when they prayed. She moved when no one else could see her. But her silence was not emptiness, it was observation. She began to notice patterns. Her father always locked the study at night, but never during the day. The key was not on his ring, but tucked inside a jar of dried beans in the pantry. Weema had a habit of hiding things under the cushion of the rocking chair in her bedroom. 3 times a month, she burned old envelopes in the fireplace. Nia once found half a letter floating in the ash before Weema caught her and slapped the paper from her hand. "You think no one sees you watching," the woman hissed, "but I know you're kind. Quiet doesn't mean innocent." That night, Weema sealed her room with a length of red string stretched across the doorway, tied in knots Nia didn't recognize. It didn't matter. Nia had already memorized the contents of her trunk. Old photographs, ink-stained maps, and a wooden box with a carved serpent on the lid. She had seen it open once. Inside were 3 things: a rusted ring, a folded cloth stained dark brown, and a brass coin with a hole in the center. The cloth, she thought, had once been white. The house grew stranger with each season. Visitors began arriving, always after dusk. Men in long coats, women with veils. Some brought herbs. Some brought jars of water or ashes. They never entered the house directly. They came to the back fence, rapped 3 times and waited. Weema always met them. Sometimes her father watched from a window. Once Nia did too. She saw her aunt hand over a letter once, pale and wax-sealed. The woman receiving it kissed Weema's hand and whispered something into her ear. Weema didn't smile. She never did. One night, Nia crept into the study. She waited until both adults were asleep, her father on the couch, an empty bottle beside him, her aunt behind her locked door, snoring faintly. Nia took the bean jar, pulled out the key and stepped into the forbidden room. The study smelled like mold and ink. Dust covered everything but the desk. There were books here, bound in cracked leather, some too brittle to touch. She found diagrams drawn in black pencil. Circles, symbols, star maps, not of any sky she knew. In a drawer she found old photographs. Her mother, young, standing beside a man who was not her father. Both were smiling, but the man's face had been scratched out. Over and over. Until nothing but a shadow remained. Behind the photo, tucked neatly, was a folded piece of parchment. A name was written on it. A name she couldn't say but instantly recognized. It wasn't her father's name. It wasn't hers. But it curled in her mind like smoke from a forgotten fire. She closed the drawer. Over the next weeks, the visitors returned more frequently. Weema grew more tense. Kazi began staying out past midnight, returning with his boots caked in mud and a wild look in his eyes. He stopped locking the windows. He stopped eating. He spoke to no one, not even Weema. Nia watched it all. She began to dream. Not of places she knew, but of voices, layers of them, whispering all at once in a language she understood only in feeling. She saw fire. She saw her mother's face fading. She saw her own face reflected in water, older than she was now, eyes glowing faintly gold. One day she awoke to find her aunt standing at her bedside, watching her. "You don't remember what you did," Weema said, not asking. Nia didn't move. Her aunt's fingers twitched at her side. "Good. Keep forgetting. If you don't speak, it won't wake. If you stay silent, it can't find its way back." She turned and left. Nia's heart pounded. She remembered something that wasn't a memory, but a pressure lodged deep in her chest. A weight. A whisper. Her silence wasn't born from trauma. It was born from containment. She hadn't stopped speaking because she was afraid. She had stopped speaking because something had asked her to. And she had listened. The attic was a place no one ever spoke of, not out of fear but as if it simply didn't exist. Neither her father nor her aunt ever mentioned it, and the hatch that led up to it was covered by an old wool rug in the hallway ceiling, blending in so seamlessly that most people would walk beneath it without ever noticing. But Nia noticed everything. She had watched her aunt pause under that spot on stormy nights, tilting her head just slightly as if listening. She'd seen her father stop short beneath it once, mouth slightly open, hand rising involuntarily before he caught himself and walked away. And she had noticed that when the wind blew from the east, the hatch would creak. Not open, not shift, just creak like something was reminding the house it was still there. Nia waited weeks before exploring it. It was deep into the dry season when she made her move, when the adults were outside attending a funeral and the heat was too thick for anyone to move quickly. She climbed the creaking hallway stool, peeled back the rug with careful fingers, and found the wooden panel above. Her heart thumped as her fingers closed around the handle. She pulled, and the hatch opened with a sound like held breath releasing. A cloud of dust fell into her face. The air smelled of old wood, dried sweat, and something sweeter, like forgotten flowers. She climbed the ladder slowly, her limbs deliberate, breath even. The attic swallowed her whole. Inside, the space was longer than she expected. It stretched above the rest of the house like a memory trapped between roof and sky. Sunlight slanted through narrow slits in the boards, painting golden lines across dust-laden beams. Boxes were stacked in a corner, and an old wardrobe leaned against the wall. A moth-eaten mattress lay forgotten beneath a slanted window. Something about it felt not quite abandoned. She stepped carefully, avoiding the warped planks. A few toys were scattered near the far corner, an old wooden top, a rusted tin soldier, and a book with the cover torn off. But it wasn't until her foot hit a slightly hollow spot in the floor that she paused. She crouched and tapped the floorboard again. It gave just a little. A loose board. It took patience to pry it up, fingernails under the edge, gentle lifting to avoid splintering. Beneath it was a cloth bundle wrapped in twine. She hesitated, pulse quickening, then pulled it out and untied it. A journal. The cover was dark leather, scarred and cracked. Inside, the pages were yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was careful, tight, and slanted slightly right. It began without a date, as if the boy who wrote it had lost track of time. If you are reading this, then you're still alive. That means something. It means maybe it didn't take you yet. Nia sat down on the mattress and read, flipping each page slowly, absorbing the words like they were her own. My name is Isin. I've lived here for 3 years. My uncle says we'll stay longer this time, but I don't believe him. Something is wrong with this house. The walls move. The corners whisper. At night, I hear footsteps in the ceiling, but there is no room above us. I told him. He slapped me. Nia felt her hands grow colder. I tried to mark the wall in my room with chalk so I could see if it shifted. Every morning the marks are gone. But not erased, moved. The wall shifts 2 inches forward. Then back. Sometimes more. I think it breathes. The entries grew more frantic over time. Isin began to write about dreams, of doors without handles, of faces staring through windows that weren't there. He described voices in the vents, voices that knew his name, that spoke in rhyme and riddle. He spoke of shadows that grew longer in the corners, and once, a hand that reached out from beneath his bed. Then there was a change in tone. I found the name. That line was underlined in thick, messy strokes. It's in the book in the study. Under the floorboard where Father used to keep his letters. The name doesn't belong to a person. It's a thing. I said it once. Just once. The wind stopped. The candle went out. I couldn't move for an hour. Nia's breath hitched. She had found no such book in the study, but perhaps there were more secrets she hadn't unearthed yet. My uncle doesn't know I heard them. He thinks I'm still asleep. But I saw him open the west room. The one sealed with salt. He whispered into the crack and something whispered back. I think it wants me. She turned the page and found lines smeared as if tears had struck the ink. But one part remained legible. The name must never be spoken. Not even in thought. Not even in dreams. But it waits for someone to speak it again. It remembers its last voice. I think it was a girl. Small. 5 years old. Her voice opened something it wasn't supposed to. Nia's hands froze. The entry was dated 20 years ago. The rest of the journal was a slow unraveling. Isin stopped writing about daily events. He wrote instead of cold spaces that followed him, of mirrors that showed other rooms. Of drawings on the walls and charcoal that he did not make, that appeared while he slept. The final entry was simple. If I disappear, I'm not dead. I'm just in between. If she speaks again, it will wake. Tell her not to. Tell her it remembers. Tell her I remember too. There was no signature. Just a smear of ink and a single fingerprint at the bottom of the page. Nia sat there for a long time, journal resting in her lap, her heart thudding like thunder muffled by soil. She had never heard the name Isin before. Her father had never mentioned anyone else living in the house. Her aunt never spoke of the attic. But this was no lie. The ink was real. The journal was real. The fear in the handwriting was real. And somehow, terrifyingly, it was connected to her. She stared at the final page. Her voice opened something it wasn't supposed to. She had no memory of what she'd said the day she went silent. Only the way the air had felt, thick, cold, humming with pressure. Only the faces looking down at her afterward. One full of horror. Another full of something she could not name. And now, after all these years, she realized the silence wasn't just hers. It had once belonged to another. She wrapped the journal again and hid it back in the floor, carefully replacing the board. She descended the attic ladder without a sound and pressed the hatch shut. She replaced the rug. Washed the dust from her hands. Then she walked back into the house, her bare feet silent on the floor, her expression blank. But inside her, a voice that was not quite hers whispered a single word. And the walls seemed to lean in to listen. The air was heavy with the scent of wilted marigolds and wet earth. A funeral bell tolled low and uncertain, as if unsure it should ring at all. The villagers gathered slowly at the chapel in the square, their eyes darting like mice too close to open ground. They came not out of grief but out of fear. Fear of not showing up. Fear of what might happen if they didn't. A man named Musa had been declared dead 3 days prior. But there was no body. Only a torn coat found beside the well at the edge of the village. A coat everyone recognized as his, patched at the elbow, stitched unevenly along the spine. The well had been dry for years, but they sealed it that morning with stones and chalk. It's a sign, the priest said. He's passed. Let the rites be done. But he didn't sound certain. Nia stood behind the crowd, half shrouded in the shadows of the fig trees. She'd watched them prepare the funeral all morning. They carried no coffin. Only the coat, folded and laid across a narrow slab of white stone. The stone, they said, was temporary, until the ground stopped shifting. The priest's voice trembled as he read from his black book. Sweat rolled down his temple even though the day was cool. We commit what remains of Musa, to the earth, and to the mercy of what lies beyond. A few murmured amens. Most stayed quiet. Nia's father was there, shoulders rigid, jaw clenched. Her aunt stood beside him in a dark shawl, her lips moving but not speaking. Nia stood apart as she always did, watching from a distance. She had only seen Musa a few times, a hunched man with a crooked smile, always muttering to himself as he walked. He'd once offered her a mango at the market, and when she didn't take it, he simply whispered, "Don't worry. It's better when you stay quiet." He hadn't been seen in over a week before his coat was found. Rumors whispered through the chapel like smoke through a thatched roof. That he'd wandered into the forest. That he'd seen something near the boundary stones. That he'd started speaking names he shouldn't have remembered. That he had been speaking in two voices. The priest finished the rites with a stammered prayer and a quick sign of the cross. People dispersed quickly after that, muttering about blessings and curses and what it meant to bury someone who hadn't bled. Nia didn't move. She watched the slab. The coat. The villagers' eyes. She knew what fear looked like. She had worn its face long before she'd known what the word meant. She could see it now in the twist of their lips, in the way they refused to look too long at the stone. That night, the sky turned yellow-gray before moonrise. Thunder grumbled in the distance, but no rain came. The house felt different, tense, swollen like wood before a storm. Her father drank earlier than usual. Her aunt lit incense and whispered to herself. Nia slipped out after midnight. The garden was still, overgrown, quiet, but not empty. She felt it before she saw it, the chill. Not wind, not weather. A cold that pressed into the bones and hummed there, low and constant. It pulsed through the grass, through the dirt, through her bare feet. Then she saw him. A figure standing near the far hedge, just beyond the orange tree. Soaked in mud, motionless, arms hanging limp at his sides. The same crooked posture. The same familiar shape of the shoulders. The glint of something like a tooth when his mouth moved. Musa. But he wasn't breathing. Not exactly. He tilted his head slowly as if the motion cost him. His eyes glowed faintly, not with light, but with memory, something old and wet and unfinished. He opened his mouth and said nothing. No sound came out. Nia stared. She didn't run. Her breath didn't quicken. Her pulse didn't stutter. She only looked. And the thing that looked like Musa tilted his head further, mouth still open as if waiting. His clothes were soaked and torn. His fingers were covered in dirt. His skin looked too thin, like paper stretched over splinters. And then he turned. He didn't walk. He moved, sideways, almost floating, until he slipped through the hedge without parting it. Gone. Nia blinked once. Then she stepped into the spot where he had stood. The earth was soft, recently turned. Her foot sank an inch into the mud. She crouched and pressed her palm to the soil. It was still warm. In the morning, the grass in that patch had turned black. No one spoke of it. No one noticed she had seen him. But that same day, her aunt burned another bundle of letters in the fireplace. Her father stayed in bed until evening. And Nia? She didn't speak. But inside her, the silence tightened, not as an absence but as a thread pulled taut. Something was unraveling. And she wasn't sure who it would take first. The rain began before nightfall, sharp and sudden, slashing against the windows like fingers trying to claw their way in. The sky had turned a bruised violet, and the air inside the house was thick, too thick, as if the storm had forced its way under the walls and refused to leave. Thunder rolled low and long as if the clouds were growling something just out of reach. Nia sat by the kitchen window, watching water race down the glass in rivulets that twisted and split like veins. The candle flickered beside her, its light wobbling with every gust. Somewhere upstairs, a door thudded gently in its frame, not slammed, not swinging, just a dull thunk-thunk like something pacing behind it. Her aunt was asleep, a half-finished prayer knotted between her fingers. Her father hadn't come home. And Nia knew, even before the lights blinked out and the candle blew itself dead, that something in the house had shifted. She didn't flinch when darkness claimed the hallway. She had lived with deeper darkness inside her for years. Instead, she rose, barefoot on the cold tile, and made her way through the corridor. Her steps were soundless. Her breath steady. The air grew colder as she passed the sitting room, colder still as she reached the hallway near the west wing. The sealed door waited at the end. She had known it her whole life, not in words because no one spoke of it, but in the way her father always looked down when passing it, and in the way her aunt's voice tightened whenever the western wind blew. The door had no knob, only a faded circle of symbols scratched above where a handle might have once been. It had been bolted shut with iron and salt since before she could remember. But tonight the bolts were gone. The salt line broken. And the door, once flush with the frame, now hung slightly ajar. It hadn't opened with noise or drama. No creaking. No screams. It had simply loosened. As if whatever held it back had finally grown tired. Or hungry. Nia stepped toward it. Every instinct told her not to. But instinct had kept her silent for 20 years, and tonight silence felt thinner than ever, like a veil stretched too tight across the mouth of a well. She pressed her fingers to the door. It swung open with a whisper. Inside, the room was cloaked in shadow, the air thick with dust and something sweeter, something rotting. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight, but she moved forward, drawn not by curiosity but by recognition. Something here remembered her. Or she remembered it. The candlelight from the hallway caught on something to her left. A crib. Broken. Its bars splintered, one leg cracked, the base sagging inward. Dust coated it in a thin, undisturbed layer. A blanket still hung over the side, faded blue, stained dark in patches that weren't from time. She turned her head slowly. Claw marks raked the walls, long, deep, erratic. Some carved into the wood. Others gouged straight through the plaster. They weren't animal marks. They were wide. Desperate. Like something trapped had tried again and again to dig its way out. And on the far wall, almost hidden between the ceiling beams and floor shadows, stood a tall mirror, covered in thick black cloth, edges nailed into the frame to hold the fabric down. It pulsed. Not visibly. Not with movement. But with presence. Nia took a step toward it, and the air seemed to contract. She reached out, her fingers brushing the fabric, not to pull it down, not yet, but to feel it. The cloth was damp. Not from the storm but from something colder. A chill sank into her skin like ink, like memory, and her throat tightened with a sensation she hadn't felt in years. Something moved inside her. Not in her body. In her silence. It shifted, pressing against the walls of her restraint, testing them. A voice, not hers, rose in the back of her skull, soft and ancient and angry. You came back. She staggered back, hand clutched to her chest. The mirror remained covered. The crib creaked. The door behind her hadn't moved, but it felt farther away. She turned again and saw something on the wall. A drawing, scrawled in charcoal, faded with time. It was a child's drawing, stick figures, a sun, a tree, and something else. A tall figure with no face, arms outstretched, painted in smears that might have once been red. Below the drawing were words. Scratched, not written. Her voice broke it. The room suddenly felt too small. Too crowded. She could feel her skin prickling, her scalp tightening. Her breath came faster. Something behind her groaned. The sound of a dragging foot. Or something heavier. She whipped around. Nothing. But the mirror pulsed again. A nail at the top loosened, slow, deliberate. A corner of the cloth slipped. Just an inch. Nia froze. Her feet were locked. Her voice was nowhere. Her heart thudded so hard it shook her ribs. And then, a whisper. Oh, familiar. Inside her head. Speak. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. And for the first time her lips parted. A sound rose, dry, cracked, too thin to hold meaning. But it was hers. Her throat burned. She did not speak. But she nearly did. The cloth slipped further. And just before she could see what lay beneath, she turned and fled the room. The door didn't slam behind her. It stayed open. Inviting. Waiting. When her aunt found her the next morning, curled at the bottom of the stairs, her skin cold and her eyes wide, she slapped her twice and shouted prayers into the air. Then she dragged her to the hearth and rubbed salt along her wrists, muttering, "You opened it. Foolish girl. You opened it." But Nia didn't react. She was still inside that room. Part of her still stood before the crib. Before the mirror. Listening. And whatever moved inside her silence that night hadn't gone away. It was still there. Waiting for the moment she would finally, truly speak. Ask ChatGPT. It began subtly as most changes did. A low hum in her bones, a trembling in the air just before sleep took her. Nia thought at first that it was her imagination, some echo of the room she should never have entered, of the cloth-covered mirror and the crib broken like a memory. But then the whispers began. Not through her ears. Not even in her mind where dreams were born. No, she heard them in her marrow, deep beneath skin and breath, where sound had no place being. They rolled through her chest like thunder muffled in the belly of the earth, and each whisper came with a feeling, not a sound. A vibration behind her ribs. A tug at her spine. The first word was always the same. Remember. It didn't come as a command, not exactly. It was closer to a plea. A request made by something that had waited too long to be remembered. Nia didn't tell her aunt. She didn't need to. Weema seemed to know. She'd become sharper since the night the sealed door opened, her hands quicker to shake, her eyes more restless. She burned herbs in every corner of the house, scattering ash beneath Nia's bed and over every threshold. She even nailed strips of black cloth over every reflective surface. Mirrors, windows, polished wood. But the whispers didn't need glass. They followed her into the kitchen, hummed at the base of her throat as she carried water from the well. They curled in the corners of her vision when she walked through the hallway. They watched her. They waited. One morning, Nia woke to find writing on the wall beside her bed. She hadn't put it there. The handwriting was narrow and looping, nothing like hers. Written in charcoal, one word repeated 3 times. Remember. 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 She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stared. Later that day, she found a notebook on the kitchen table. Her aunt's old ledger, pages yellowed, corners bent from years of use. Nia didn't remember bringing it there, but her fingers reached for it without hesitation. And then, slowly, she opened to a blank page. The pen was already in her hand. And her hand began to move. At first, she thought she was simply writing down what she'd heard. But the handwriting wasn't hers. The loops were too tight, the angles too sharp. She tried to stop, but her wrist kept moving, her fingers curving with a will of their own. Her heart pounded. Sweat beaded on her forehead. But the words poured out, steady and silent, across the page. The voice is buried. The voice is chained. The voice is not yours, but you carried it. You were the lock. Now you are the key. She dropped the pen. Her aunt entered just moments later. Weema froze when she saw the page. Her mouth twisted and she rushed forward, slamming the book shut. Her hands trembled as she turned to Nia. You wrote this, she snapped. Nia did not nod. Her aunt grabbed her wrist and shook her. Did you write this? Still Nia said nothing. Weema stared into her eyes, searching. Then, slowly she released her. I warned your father, she muttered, turning away. I told him the seal wouldn't last. That blood alone isn't enough. Her voice was brittle with fear. She burned the notebook that night in the hearth, pressing it deep into the flame with a poker, whispering the same phrase over and over. She must not speak. She must not remember. But the fire didn't matter. The next morning, new writing appeared. This time on the wall above the fireplace. Written not in charcoal, but in something darker. Not red. Not black. Something in between. The same looping script. She is waking. We remember her. She must remember us. Nia touched the words. They were cold. That night, the whispers grew louder, not in volume but in clarity. She could feel them moving through her body, speaking to each part of her like it had its own ear. Her feet twitched when they said, walk back. Her hands clenched when they said, unbind. And always, always, the same refrain. Remember. She began to dream of the broken crib. Of a baby's cry that didn't sound like any baby's cry she'd ever heard, low, shaking the windows, rattling through the walls. She began to dream of the mirror with the cloth half pulled, and of a face behind it. Not her own. Older. Pale. Watching her with eyes like molten gold. She woke with tears she didn't remember crying. With bruises on her palms. With ash in her fingernails. Her aunt locked her in her room after that. I begged your mother not to speak your name that night, Weema told her through the door. I told her it would hear her. And it did. It did. You were only 5, but you spoke before your time. And it heard you. Nia didn't move. Didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Inside her, something was moving for her. That evening, as the storm rolled in again and wind clawed against the shutters, she sat in the center of her room and opened another notebook. Again her hand moved. This time it drew instead of writing. Circles. Chains. A cracked mouth. A woman bound in flame. And below it all, a word she had never read before. But somehow she knew what it meant. It was the name. The one she had spoken when she was 5. The one the boy in the attic had warned against. She shut the book and placed it under her bed. In the silence that followed, she heard the whisper again. Speak me. Free me. But still, she did not speak. Because she was starting to understand something her aunt could never admit. Her silence was not a protection. It was a countdown. It began with a reflection. Not in the silvered mirror covered by cloth, but in a spill of rainwater near the back door, a mirror only the sky could lay. Nia had been walking through the house just after a storm passed, barefoot and silent as always, when something pulled her gaze downward. The puddle rippled, no wind, no motion. Just a ripple. A breath across water. In its surface she saw not herself but something older. Her features were there, yes, but wrong. Her eyes too gold, her mouth slightly parted as if whispering something only the water knew. Nia stepped back, heart racing, but the voice returned, not through her ears, not in her bones, but everywhere at once. Say me. The name. The one she had written in looping ink without knowing how. The one that lingered behind her silence like smoke behind glass. She needed to know. That night, when the lamps had burned low and her aunt began her evening prayers, Nia crept into the west wing again. The sealed room waited, still open, its air colder than it should have been. Dust swirled like ash in the beams of moonlight coming through the slats. The crib stood as broken as ever. The walls still bore the claw marks. And the mirror, still cloaked. But one corner was now fully exposed. A crack ran across the glass, thin but deep, like something behind it had pressed too hard. Nia stared at it. Her face wavered in the fragment. And then the voice returned. Not your curse. Their chain. She knew then it was time to ask. But not with her mouth. That night, she wrote it on a torn piece of paper and slid it beneath her aunt's bedroom door. A single question. Was it my voice that cursed him? The house was silent for hours. Nia sat by the fire, her hands still, her breath slow. She didn't expect a response. But just before dawn, the door creaked open behind her. Her aunt's bare feet padded into the room. Weema looked thinner in the low firelight, her face pale and pinched, her hair unwrapped and graying in streaks Nia had never noticed. In her hands she held the note. It trembled like a leaf caught in the last breath of a storm. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she sat on the opposite stool, knees cracking softly. Her voice, when it came, was smaller than Nia had ever heard it. Your mother didn't know, she said, eyes on the fire. She didn't know what she was carrying. She thought she was just lucky to have you after so many years of trying. She thought the storms were coincidence. She thought the dreams were just dreams. Nia watched her. She did not move. Weema clenched the paper tighter. You were born in the middle of thunder. Lightning hit the river. 2 oxen died. A woman in labor 3 houses down lost her child when you took your first breath. She shook her head. But no one blamed you then. Not yet. Nia tilted her head slightly. Waiting. I was the first to hear it, Weema said, voice cracking. Your first word. You were barely walking. Still drooling. Still holding your mama's finger like it was a lifeline. She swallowed. And then you said it. That name. Just once. You'd never spoken before. Not even babble. You looked straight at your father and said it. Nia's pulse thundered. He dropped dead, Nia. Right there. A full-grown man. Healthy. Laughing 1 second, dead the next. No wound. No poison. His heart just stopped. Eyes wide. Mouth open like he was going to scream. Weema's hands were white around the paper now. We didn't know what it meant. But the way the wind stopped, the way the house creaked like it was listening, we knew it wasn't normal. She looked up, finally meeting Nia's gaze. I told your mother to keep you quiet. To never let you speak again. We begged the elders. They said a spirit had entered you. That the voice wasn't yours. That you had been chosen as a vessel, a mouth for something sealed long ago. Nia blinked once. Her chest felt like stone. We sealed the room because that's where it happened. Where the name took root. Your father had been researching the old stories. He was getting too close. You spoke what he had only just begun to uncover. She laughed bitterly. Maybe it wasn't your voice at all. Maybe it was his echo in you. Nia reached into her pocket and drew out a slip of paper. On it she wrote. Was it my fault? Weema's face crumpled. No, Nia, she whispered. It was never your fault. You were a child. You were a mouth. They used you. It used you. You didn't know. And we punished you like you did. Tears welled in her aunt's eyes. We silenced you when we should have protected you. We should have fought it. Should have learned its name. But we were cowards. We thought if we buried it in silence, it would die. Nia's throat tightened. But the voice was already stirring again just under her skin. Now you know. Say me true. She stood slowly. Weema reached for her. Don't. Nia, please. If you speak again. But Nia gently placed her hand on her aunt's arm. She did not speak. Not yet. But something deep within her, a memory, a truth, a storm, was rising. The silence had protected no one. The curse had never been hers. The voice wasn't just waiting to be used, it was waiting to be answered. And Nia, for the first time in her life, was ready to reply. The pressure started 3 days before her birthday, a slow, deliberate tightening in her chest. Not pain. Not fear. Just presence. Like someone pressing their forehead gently against hers from the inside. She couldn't draw a deep breath. Her throat tickled with weight. And when she closed her eyes, she didn't see darkness. She saw words. Swirling, molten, ancient things. They didn't make sense at first. They danced and looped in her dreams, burning themselves into the corners of her vision. Some nights she woke with her pillow damp, her tongue sore. From humming. Humming songs she didn't know she knew. The voice in her bones no longer whispered. It waited. And the waiting was louder than any cry. Her aunt had grown thinner, quieter. Weema no longer tried to burn the words or shield the mirrors. She simply watched Nia as one might watch a fuse approach a flame, with awe, with dread, with a grief that came too late to change anything. If you speak, she had whispered the night before, say it with your own voice this time. Not his. Not its. But Nia no longer feared the name. She had tasted it in dreams. She had seen it flicker behind her eyes when she blinked too long. It had lived in her bones for so long it felt like a part of her. A shadow, a twin, a breath caught in her lungs since she was 5 years old. The house knew too. The walls groaned in stillness. The hallways shifted their shape subtly, doorways narrower, windows darker. The wind had stopped blowing through the broken west wing. The room of the mirror stood in silence, and above the fireplace, the black cloth had begun to unravel on its own. On the morning of her 25th birthday, the sky was perfectly still. No birds sang. The wind held its breath. Weema left a cup of tea outside her door, then fled to the far end of the village. The mirror cracked just after noon. Nia was alone in the sealed room when it happened. She had stood before the tall glass every day that week, letting it show her only what it would. Never herself. Always flickers, of fire, of a child's face pressed to a crib bar, of a man falling without a wound. That day it showed her an eye, gold and endless and watching. And then a sound like the shatter of ice across stone. A single line split the mirror from top to bottom. Not broken, opened. The pressure in her throat surged. She gasped and dropped to her knees, her hands at her chest, eyes wide. She could feel it rising now, not just a word, not just a name, but a truth. Hers. Twisted for years into silence, stretched like wire under skin. The sun dipped low. Shadows crept across the floor like fingers. And then as the moon rose, Nia stood. She didn't think. Didn't plan. The sound that rose from her throat was not a whisper, not a scream. It was a name, spoken gently, clearly like a key turning in a lock. Irileth. The house groaned. The mirror's cloth fell to the floor. The crack in the glass glowed gold, and behind it something smiled, not cruel, not kind, but knowing. The word left her lips and hung in the air like smoke. Outside dogs began to howl. Somewhere far off a tree split in half. And in the silence that followed, Nia felt something tear loose from inside her. Not leaving, not vanishing, but joining her. Completing a circuit that had waited 20 years to close. She was not afraid. She had spoken. And something had heard. It happened the moment her breath left her lips. The name Irileth still echoed in the air when the scream tore through the village. Not hers. Someone else's. Sure. Guttural. Human. And then abruptly silenced. Nia didn't flinch. She stood in the cracked mirror room, the word she had spoken still ringing like a bell inside her chest. She felt the ripple move outward, through the walls, through the soil, through the air itself. Something old unfolding, a door groaning open after being locked for lifetimes. Then came the pounding at the door downstairs. Shouts. Panic. Someone crying that the butcher's boy was dead. Not sick. Not wounded. Just gone, his body burst open like glass dropped on stone. No mark of a weapon. No attacker seen. Only the blood. And the way his mouth had been open, like he tried to scream a name that burned his throat before it ever made a sound. Nia stood in the hallway as her aunt came running, half-dressed, face gray. You said it. Weema's voice cracked like ice. Dear heavens, Nia. You said it. The girl nodded, calm as stone. You have no idea what you've done. But Nia did know. She didn't cry. Didn't explain. She turned her face to the wind coming through the west wing. The house exhaled for the first time in years, and whispered a name only she could hear now. Not Irileth. Her own. The villagers were in chaos. Doors slammed. Children pulled indoors. Priests were summoned. Bells rang though there was no funeral yet. They would blame her, of course. They already had. Her birth, her silence, her strange stillness, all of it made her the perfect vessel for their fear. But it wasn't fear in her anymore. It was clarity. She found her aunt packing a cloth bag with dried meat, salt, matches. "You have to leave," Weema whispered. "Before they come. Before it takes another." Nia picked up a charcoal stick and scrawled across the table. The voice wasn't a curse. It was sealed. Someone twisted it. Her aunt stared at the words, then slowly sat down, hands shaking. "Yes," she whispered. "But you were never supposed to open it." Nia met her eyes and wrote, "Then why does it feel like I finally belong to myself?" The silence between them was wound, deep and painful. Weema looked at her, not with anger but with shame. Then she folded her hands and told the truth at last. There was another voice. Long ago. It was power, yes, but it was also balance. People used to guard it, speak it only in ritual. But someone tried to use it. To control it. They tried to own what was meant only to unlock. So the voice turned on them. Burned them. She swallowed. The survivors sealed it. Into a name. And when you were born, you carried that name without even knowing it. Your silence wasn't punishment, Nia. It was the only protection we had. For you and for all of us. Nia blinked. Then wrote one more line. Then who twisted it? Her aunt said nothing. But her eyes flicked to the wall. To the old drawing of Nia's father. And suddenly Nia understood. The boy in the attic. The sealed room. The symbols her father had carved. His obsession with the old names. He hadn't been a guardian. He had tried to use her. And the voice had stopped him, through her. The death that followed today, it wasn't punishment. It was balance being restored. The name had been twisted by selfish hands. And now it had spoken back. But her voice, her real voice, wasn't meant to kill. It was a key. A key that could open, yes. But maybe, also close. She stepped into the storm building outside. The sky boiled violet. The wind coiled around her like breath held too long. Somewhere behind her, the mirror whispered her name. She didn't flinch. Because she had finally remembered who she was. And what she was meant to unlock. Nia stepped out into the village just as the morning mist curled low over the rooftops, dragging silence behind her like a long, rippling veil. Her footsteps echoed softly on the dirt path, and though no one stood in the open, she could feel them watching, eyes behind curtains, breath held behind shuttered windows. She didn't shout. She didn't scream. She simply walked. And the air listened. Everywhere she passed, birds fell quiet, not out of fear but reverence. The sky overhead, still bruised from the storm, throbbed with a strange light, neither sun nor cloud. It pulsed like breath, like memory. They thought she was bringing ruin, that if she spoke again someone else would die. But Nia felt no death in her now. What lived inside her voice was not a curse, it was a return, a rebalancing. The world had been twisted by silence too long. She stopped in the village square, where the priest once burned her name from the scrolls. Now the scrolls lay in ashes. And the stone well, once sealed after the man named Musa disappeared, trembled beneath her feet. She turned to it and whispered, "Peace." The stone cracked down the center. No explosion. No tremor. Just a long, deep exhale, like the earth letting go of something it had clenched for decades. A thin stream of water bubbled up, clean and clear. The first in years. The doors stayed closed, but someone sobbed from within one of the homes. A woman cried, not in pain but relief. Nia moved on. The old schoolhouse's bell, once rusted shut, let out a single chime as she passed, unprovoked. A soft breeze followed her now, circling her feet and fluttering the edges of her hair, lifting it like invisible hands were braiding light through it. She came at last to the house. Her house. It had always been more than stone and wood. It had held secrets in its walls, memories in its beams, breath in its stairwells. Now as she stood before it, it seemed to sigh. The doors opened without her touch. Inside, her aunt waited, on her knees, hands pressed together, eyes full of a lifetime of guilt. Nia did not punish. She knelt beside her and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Her voice, when she spoke, was quieter than rain. "You were afraid." Weema sobbed. "I tried to protect you. I was wrong." "Yes," Nia said without cruelty. She rose and turned toward the west wing. The sealed room, the beginning of all things. It was already crumbling. The floor had split along the grain. The walls had gone soft with rot and memory. The mirror, uncovered fully now, no longer reflected anything. Only light. Golden. Flickering like a heartbeat. The sigil in the glass pulsed once, then shattered silently. And from the heart of the room something lifted. A presence. Not a body. Not a beast. But a being of breath and will and old pain. It shimmered like heat on stone, and as it rose, it bowed to Nia. Bowed not in servitude but in recognition. It had been trapped in her silence. It had borrowed her voice to try to escape. But only she who bore the name and the memory could free it. "Go," she whispered. And it did. It passed through the walls without a sound. The room folded in on itself, boards collapsing gently as if finally allowed to rest. The shadows melted. The stale air turned sweet. Light crept in from places it never had before. She stepped out into the sun. People had gathered now, hesitantly from a distance. Some knelt. Some covered their mouths. Others wept quietly. None dared speak. But Nia did. She faced them all, her voice steady. "You feared what you never tried to understand. You silenced me to save yourselves." But the silence was the wound. The wind stilled to hear her. The birds returned, landing on rooftops and fences. Children peered from behind legs, wide-eyed. Nia looked up to the sky, calm now, clear, and spoke her name aloud. For the first time in 20 years. "I am Nia." The air rang with it. No thunder. No death. Just truth. From that day forward, when Nia spoke, the world listened. Because in her voice lived the memory of what had been sealed, and the power of what had finally been set free.